They were sleeping in a cemetery because that was their safest option. Their lives have been threatened by their parents.
A good portion of homeless youth are never even reported missing.
Having the people who are supposed to love you the most kick you out and threaten your life. What could be worse than that? So a lot of queer and trans youth are experiencing hidden homelessness, primarily sleeping in parks, in vehicles, couch surfing. They're used to being silenced. They're not listened to. Nobody wants to hear their stories.
One of the number one things we can give to somebody is our positive attention.
Queer and trans folks, they live everywhere. We live all across the country and also experience homelessness in all communities across the country. Why do we have to wait for a young person's life to be threatened by their parents before we actually respond? People love to complicate stuff, and it's not that complicated, the solutions.
I adore Dr. Alex Abramovich. He is a senior scientist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, associate professor at the University of Toronto, and he leads research on 2SLGBTQ plus youth, homelessness, mental health, and transgender health. Alex shares about this really awesome community-based research and storytelling project, and he tells how his personal story connects to this work.
Alex, it's so good seeing you.
So great to see you. It's been a long time.
It's been maybe 6 years, 7 years.
Yeah, that's right.
What have you been up to?
Well, I've been up to a lot. A lot has happened since the last time we spoke. I direct a program of research that focuses on 2S LGBTQ youth homelessness and health, mental health. All the projects that I lead are primarily in the area of queer and trans youth homelessness, health. I do quite a bit of work in the area of transgender health as well. Yeah, since the last time we spoke, I've definitely been, leading a bunch of studies on COVID, the impacts of COVID we've been looking at. We've been looking at, the pathways. We have this project called Pathways Interrupted, where we've been looking at hidden homelessness among queer and trans youth in 3 cities.
Can you explain that? Because I know what hidden homelessness is as it relates to family homelessness.
Okay.
And I could make a couple assumptions here what it is, but I'd rather hear from the expert.
For sure. Yeah. So, when we talk about hidden homelessness, we're talking about young people who are not accessing institutional settings, shelters, transitional housing programs. They are primarily sleeping in parks, in vehicles, couch surfing. Yeah. So a lot of queer and trans youth are experiencing hidden homelessness because many of the programs are just really not designed in a way that would keep them safe.
Right.
They're not inclusive. So, a lot of the youth who I've worked with over the years, they do anything to avoid programs, right? And they're often, they're often unsafe. They're typically unsafe on a daily basis, and they're, choosing between unsafe situations, right?
Right.
So that's why we decided to focus this work on hidden homelessness, because so many of them are experiencing hidden homelessness.
Now, the one thing I do know is the lack of support for queer and trans youth and adults.
Yes.
So what did you find in your research?
Yeah, so for this study, we worked with groups of youth in 3 different cities. So in Toronto, York region, which is a suburban, semi-rural setting just north of Toronto, and then London, Ontario.
Yeah.
And so we recruited youth in these different settings. We hired peer researchers as well.
Awesome.
Yeah, it was very cool. And each of the youth, we worked with them to share their stories over film. It's called cell film, the method, right? And so they basically created these short, TikTok type of videos that just sort of explained either their perspective or their experience with hidden homelessness.
Right. It's interesting that you brought that up, because I was just going to give you a segue to promote your film, because there's an event coming up, right?
There's an event.
I don't know if this podcast will be released by then, but if it is, when's the event?
The event is the official film screening that incorporates, all of the youth who we worked with, shares all of their stories through this 32-minute film. And we'll be screening it on November 28th. The event starts at 5:30. It's in Toronto at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in the West End. We've got flyers. There's a QR code. You could register. And it's going to be pretty exciting.
Let's say this podcast airs after. How would somebody find the film?
So the film won't be public for a little while, because we're going to be presenting and sharing the film in different venues. And so eventually it will be made public on my website, which is alexabramovich.me.
Great. We covered both bases there.
That's right.
So, we got a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
And I just adore you.
Oh, thank you.
You've always been so honest. This touches what I do. So How did you pick the youth? What challenges did you have? Did you give them cameras? I mean, give me some of the backstory, the behind the scenes of how this project, the logistics.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a great question. Recruitment is always really
Yeah.
tough.
Since 2008, Invisible People has been working to change the story of homelessness, and we are so grateful that millions upon millions of people have watched our content, and we have received a lot of media over the years. But it's this podcast that I'm getting recognized, and it means the world because it validates that this podcast is reaching the right people, and you all are loving it. So thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a great question. Recruitment is always really
Yeah.
tough. It's always
Because
really
you have,
difficult.
you're vulnerable, and there's other, not just of homelessness, but of youth, and also being queer and trans.
Totally, right? And so oftentimes youth don't know who they can trust, especially for, queer and trans folks, not knowing, are you going to be safe? Can I disclose my identity? And so for me as a, queer trans researcher, it's always been really important for me to be pretty open about my own identity and to let the young people know why I do the work that I do, how I came to this work, just, to let them know that my heart is in the right place, and I'm why I'm doing this work.
Do you
right?
want to go there a little?
Sure. Yeah.
So why do you do this work?
So like I said, I'm queer, I'm trans. I came out twice in my life. I had two really big coming out experiences. They were, let's say, very challenging, right? They were complicated, difficult. I do this work because it comes from a very, very personal place. I feel deeply connected to the work that I do and very passionate about the work that I do. And so had it not been for my own life experience, at a young age, let's say, I probably wouldn't be doing the work that I do today. So it really comes from a very personal place.
So you find the youth, the recruitment, what then?
So recruiting them, very difficult, right? And so obviously having done this work for a number of years, I've been doing this work for over 15 years. And so I'm a community-based researcher. So I work closely with communities, with organizations. And so having those connections, obviously super helpful in terms of recruiting young people. So we really relied on those connections. But then we also hired peer researchers, young people with lived experience in each of the three cities. They are also very connected to youth in those settings. And so they really helped us recruit youth. And we weren't even looking to recruit like a huge number of youth. It was like a pretty manageable number in each of the cities. So then once we recruited the youth in each of the settings, we held these workshops on how to do self-film. My co-principal investigator, Katie, she is an expert on this method of self-film. So she led this workshop on like, okay, what is self-film? How do you share your story using film? And so we had tablets, and then most of the youth had their own cell phones. So they decided, I don't want to use a tablet, I'm going to use my cell phone.
I'd be the same way.
Right? Yeah, exactly. And so we spent 2 days, 2 full days working on understanding what is the method, how do we share our story, what story do you want to share, what elements, and then they created their films. And then we met again, a second day, and some of them, they wanted to revise it, or they're just like, no, I don't like it, I want to go back and redo it. And then they shared it as a group.
So now did they edit it and everything?
No, you don't edit it. That's the thing about it, is that you just do it in one shot.
Oh, I got you. It's like short social video,
Totally.
TikTok. Sorry,
right.
I'm a boomer. My mind immediately goes to old school.
I know, right? Totally, yeah.
Yeah.
And I've never done it this way either. I've done it like the old school sort of
Right.
way, right? I'm used to doing like digital storytelling, where you
Right.
go back, you edit, you take your time, But this is different. They spent more time just kind of thinking up the story that they want to tell, and bringing it to a place where it's like, okay, I'm going to do this in one shot, and then just keep redoing it till you can do it in that one shot.
I'm really intrigued, and we'll go into other parts of your research. But one thing that I talk about, because the lived experience is, the big conversation, right?
Right.
There are a lot of homeless people, formerly homeless people, that are using TikTok and using YouTube. And some use it for advocacy. Some use it just for journaling, for their own mental health and, to give them purpose. And there's a woman, her name is Court, on TikTok. She's probably got about 400,000 followers. She's no longer homeless, but when she was homeless living in a shelter, she was doing this content like she's rating her psych medicines that she was getting.
Wow.
So she would, on TikTok, they prescribed me trazodone, and this is how I felt. I mean, it's just brilliant, and we don't empower people like that, right? To share their own stories. So I love that that's what you guys are doing. That's your model.
Absolutely, because so many of the youth, I mean, the majority of the youth who I work with, like they're used to being silenced. They're not listened to. Nobody wants to hear their stories. And they are constantly having to navigate life thinking about like, what can I say? What should I not say? Should I share this part of myself? Should I not share this part? And here we come to this situation where we're like, no, we want to hear it all. We want to hear your story, and your story is going to help make a difference. Your story can really change the world, like this is what we need. We need to share your story.
Right.
I think that was actually very empowering for them, where it's like, no, we want to hear it from you. You are, you're the expert of your own situation, of your story. It was definitely a really sort of successful method in that sense, and something that I'll definitely be doing again.
One of the things that I've learned is one of the number one things we can give to somebody is our positive attention. And I know often programs people fight for the privacy of their clients, and they should. If they're not, they're in the wrong position.
Yeah.
And then your communications team is fighting for stories, which they should. And I think in an organization, that is healthy tension. And people don't realize, the marketing's always trying to get a story. The programs people won't let me interview their clients. And by having that tension, you're going to find balance so people will not be hurt, because you have to be very conscious of, one, that person might be reliving trauma. They're going public with their story, and there's some things, both good and bad, that can happen from that. And from my own experience, I have seen firsthand how empowering it is for people to share their own story publicly, and especially on something like a film that's going to get seen in a positive way.
Absolutely. And you know what? It's true. There are so many different situations, and that's something that we definitely spend a lot of time speaking with the participants about. Like, do you feel comfortable? Like, is this what you want to share? Like, so really taking the time to think through, like, what parts of my story do I want to share? There are so many ways to anonymize your story. You don't have to show your face. You don't have to show listen, it doesn't have to be your voice. Like, there are so many different ways, and they came up with really creative ways of sharing their story, or not even necessarily always like sharing their experience. Like, this is what I went through, but even just like, this is what I learned. This is my perspective of the, of the situation. And, taking like film aside, but like I interview youth a lot. Obviously I'm a researcher, and so I'm a qualitative researcher. So I do a lot of in-depth one-on-one interviews. And I have found that oftentimes youth are really reluctant and really hesitant. Like, oh, I don't know if I want to talk to you. Like, I'm just going to do it for like, the little bit of money here. I'll do it for that, whatever. But then afterwards, so many times, like the majority of youth are like, wow, that was actually like really therapeutic. And I feel so much better just sharing this with you and having the opportunity to talk for an hour. I'm going to like tell my friends about this. And so it's great. Like, when that happens, safety is a big issue for a lot of youth. And so many of the youth who I work with, like their lives have been threatened by their parents. Literally, they had to leave home because it's like they came out and the parent was like, I'm going to end your life. Like you need, not even you need to leave. I'm going to end your life. Right. In many circumstances, like they've had to run away because it's like either I stay and I die, or I leave and I try to find a way to live. And so in those situations, like obviously they're not going to go online and share their story and their face, and it's like, oh, this is where I'm living right now, type of thing. So I think there's so many different situations that we need to really consider when doing this type of work.
Exactly. And what people don't realize, runaways is a common paradigm, if you would. But in many situations, these are throwaways. Right? I know the first time that I heard that a good portion of homeless youth are never even reported missing because the parents are throwing them out, often because they come out, but, for whatever reason, they just throw them out, and that's got to be horrible. I mean, it is horrible.
Yeah, it's devastating, truly. And it's like you're coming from this situation where you've been thrown out, you've been kicked out. One would think, okay, hopefully they will find support. What can be worse than having the people who are supposed to love you the most kick you out and threaten your life? What could be worse than that? And so you think, all right, they will leave and they will find shelter. They will find support and safety. Right. Oftentimes they don't. They leave and they find themselves in a highly unsafe situation once again, where they are threatened, they are experiencing stigma and discrimination and violence, and they have to navigate these settings, these institutional settings that are meant to support everyone facing this type of a threat. And so the reason that we look at this issue of hidden homelessness is because so many of the youth are like, well, I can't stay at home and I can't stay in the shelter. So what am I going to do? I need to choose between these two unsafe situations. And so For example, I recently led a study where I worked with youth in the greater Toronto area, like after COVID, and I heard from multiple youth who reported that they were sleeping in a cemetery because that was their safest option. Like, can you imagine, like, a cemetery in Toronto? That was their safest option. And like, I've been doing this work for a long time, and I'm well aware of the housing crisis, and I'm aware of that. But something about hearing that really struck me. It stayed with me.
And I'm just assuming it's because less people go there, right? And people don't. You're not going to have police walking by. You're not going to have the public walking by. You're not going to have other youth that can often be violent.
That's right.
On homeless youth.
That's right. Yeah.
Earlier you said an acronym.
Yes.
And I just heard it for the first time last night. It's more of a Canadian thing. Could you explain it?
2SLGBTQ, right? A little different than the acronym used in the States.
Yeah.
And so the difference is 2S, meaning two-spirit, which is a term used by North American Indigenous folks who identify as two-spirit, as having in some cases, a feminine and a masculine spirit or identity. And this identity is reserved for people who are Indigenous, of course.
Right.
And who, it could be a gender identity, it could also be sexual orientation, but it's also a spiritual identity as well.
I actually love it. I adore the Indigenous culture. And when I heard that for the first time last night, I immediately recognized, the meaning. You handed a flyer for your movie, and I saw it, and then you were talking about it. And I know some of the people listening probably never have heard it before, so I thought we should at least explain it.
Yeah, of course, exactly, and that's 2SLGBTQ. For a long time, the acronym changes, language changes.
Right.
We've got to keep up with it, and so for a long time, it was people would use the acronym LGBTQ2S. We've made some changes recently, and two-spirit comes first.
I like it.
A lot of Indigenous people are used to being placed last and being silenced and not being heard, and so we make an effort to ensure that 2S always comes first.
Right. So explain what we're doing good. Well, let's start with what we're doing bad and the crisis, and then some bright spots.
When it comes to 2SLGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness?
Please, because that's your expertise.
Absolutely.
I told you, if you want to talk about fishing, we could talk about fishing.
Not so much my expertise. Right. Yeah, that's right. So we have come a long way in recent years. We've certainly come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. I'm going to say youth, because I focus on youth. Youth is really my area of expertise. And also, when we look at like homelessness, 2SLGBTQ youth are really disproportionately overrepresented.
Well, I'll be candid. Why I wanted to have this conversation with you is because it's youth focused. Because I'm going to be talking about adult homelessness, Indigenous homelessness, shelter homelessness, housing first homelessness. So you're youth specific, and that's the direction I was hoping we would go in. Yeah. I knew we would.
Yeah, right. That's right. Yeah. So, for a long time, we didn't have any specialized population-based services, let's say housing programs, specifically for queer and trans youth, which we know from research is absolutely necessary. We need these types of programs. And there's been a lot of debate, a lot of arguments, like, if you segregate them, then you're just creating that's like segregation, and you're creating more of an issue. But that's actually not true at all, because we have population-based services for many different populations, and we know that they work, and we know that they actually save lives, right? And so it took many, many years to fight and to advocate for these services to be opened in Canada. Right. Many of these services opened in the States long before they opened in Canada, right?
And there's still a huge lack of services for LGBT youth.
Oh, yeah. Across Canada, absolutely.
Well, I was talking the States,
but also in
I'm
Canada.
Sure,
in Canada, sure. We've opened up, some very specific housing programs, right? Like transitional housing programs, supportive housing programs, which are great. And, those programs are always full, but there are not nearly enough programs of this type across the country. Right. And we can't just, think of we'll open up a few programs in large urban settings and that should do. No, because queer and trans folks, they live everywhere. We live all across the country and also experience homelessness in all communities across the country. So we need to make sure that we have targeted support programs, right? And I mean, of course, it's not just like, okay, open up these shelters. Even if we opened up these, population-based shelters or housing programs across the country, right? That's not going to solve the problem. That's part of the solution, right? And that's what it is that there are many components to solving this problem. There are so many things that we need to be doing simultaneously in order to actually solve these issues.
Over the last couple of years, at least in the States, and I'm sure here, is that there's been a big movement for prevention. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to prevent queer and trans homelessness, youth homelessness, we've got to change the stigma. We've got to change, you know what I mean? Because parents are kicking their kids out. I always say it's the front door and the back door, right? That's the front door of people or youth entering into homelessness. And as a society, we have to do that.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. And
that's extremely hard. Right? That's
know
what I mean?
Totally.
But we have to be vigilant.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think we should be working with the school system, for a lot of youth, really trying to target the situation before they become homeless. I think that oftentimes when it comes to 2SLGBTQ populations, there has to be a tragedy. There has to be a tragedy, and then we respond, then we react. And so it's always reactionary. It's never thinking about, okay, how do we actually prevent these tragedies from occurring in the first place? Why aren't we talking about that? Why do we always react when there's a tragedy? Why do we wait for a tragedy to occur? Why do we have to wait for a young person's life to be threatened by their parents and for them to be sleeping in a cemetery before we actually respond and think about, well, how do we actually prevent that from happening in the first place? Can we work within the school system? Can we work with families? And is there a way to maybe prevent some of these young people from experiencing homelessness in the first place? And I know, through my work and other research, oftentimes we cannot prevent them from becoming homeless. We can't. But many times there is a family member who is supportive. Yeah. Maybe it's not their parents, but oftentimes there is somebody in that network.
To family of some
Yes, and that person, there often is someone who is supportive. And so maybe we need to be spending more time thinking, working on those relationships and working on reunifying youth with those supportive people.
I remember early on when I was traveling, and this was back when social media was actually good.
Right.
Years ago. And I remember visiting a youth organization where they would work with the client, kid, or whatever, to get them on Facebook, hoping that there would be a reconnection to an uncle or an aunt or a cousin that is supportive as a path out of homelessness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we need to be, spending more time doing that. And I know that some programs are starting to do that. And just reimagining, what do we consider family? And how do we talk about family? How do we reconnect with family?
Right. To me, family is broader meaning for me because my family has become Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. Right. So it's more community.
Yes.
Right? Because I don't have that direct connection to a family member. So my community becomes my family, wherever that support is. So I think it's important to not just think, oh, it's a relative, because a relative, as we're talking about, could be the cause of homelessness.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
Totally.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So is there a community to build around this person? And
exactly. Very similar for 2SLGBTQ youth is that people, a lot of queer and trans youth are relying on their communities, on these peer support networks. And we've found through research also that in many cases that is actually life-saving. It's a protective factor against suicide, especially for trans youth. I've worked with a lot of these different housing programs that are specifically geared towards 2SLGBTQ youth in Canada. So I've worked closely with the programs that have opened, and I've done some evaluating of these programs. And we have found in pretty much in every case that youth always report a sense of belonging and safety that they've never felt in their life. Yeah. For many youth, it's like, wow, this is the first time that I'm living in a place that actually feels like home, and where I don't actually fear for my safety. Right. What a feeling. And, they always explain that, oh my gosh, here I am. I come home. I feel like I'm at home, and I don't have to worry. I don't have to worry that someone's going to threaten to kill me or, and it's this such a relief. Obviously that not everything is perfect, clearly, there are still many things that need to be fixed, that need to be changed. But in so many cases, they really feel a very strong sense of belonging and safety in these programs. So even that alone should tell us the main pathway into homelessness is family conflict, family rejection.
Well, I was chief marketing officer for a very large rescue mission in central New York.
Okay.
So it's a faith-based organization. We had more housing units than we had shelter beds. And we tried to be very inclusive to the point where we were building an LGBT youth shelter because we're very much aware there's a problem here in even central New York of queer and trans kids being kicked out and having no place to go. Right. We felt it was important to provide that support. And what we did, the organization, was partner with a local LGBT youth organization. And I learned a lot about that. I learned not only about the need, but the challenges, because we're a faith-based organization. And we actually had to leave the National Gospel Rescue Mission because they were fighting against gay marriage. And it was like, we're supposed to just help hurting people. That's all we're supposed to do, right? Let the theologians, let everybody else fight over this other stuff, right? Yeah. And what our CEO said, and I totally back up, and I remember, he said is, we cannot have an LGBTQ shelter and fight against gay marriage, right? We can't say, hey, we're here to support you, but not actually support them. One of the things that I really appreciated about his leadership was to really make it inclusive through the lens of the client, which is this LGBT homeless youth. Yeah. So what makes a good inclusive program?
It's a very, very important question. And I think that it's so important to build those strong partnerships with organizations that are doing the work, and they're doing it well. There are, like with the 2SLGBTQ community center or whatever program it might be, to work closely. And, obviously training is key. I mean, I often talk about the need for like a standardized model of care, like within the housing sector, because oftentimes youth talk about just never knowing what to expect. Yeah. It's like I go to the shelter, I don't know who's going to be working. I know that there's this one worker where it's no problem, I can disclose my identity. But then there's this other one that I know they're going to treat me differently. I know that this is going to happen. I don't know if they're going to ask me this question or that question. So it's never the same, right? And so if we have a more standardized approach, a more standardized model of care, we know that all of the staff, all of the management and staff working at the housing program, everyone's receiving the same type of training with regards to 2SLGBTQ inclusion. So everyone's being trained in a very similar sort of way and has a similar kind of understanding, right? So we can start with that. We can make sure that the questions that we ask at intake, that they're inclusive questions. Right. When I say inclusive question, I mean not assuming, somebody's pronouns, or not assuming what their gender identity is just based on how they look, but by actually asking. And people are often so afraid, to ask these questions or to even say pronouns. And it's very easy. It's just like, hi, I'm Alex. I go by he, him. And what is your name? And how can I refer to you? And it's as easy as that, right? And that can really make a huge difference for a young person who's accessing your program. A young person is much more likely to answer openly and honestly if they see their own identity reflected, right? And so people need to see themselves reflected in the programs that they access from everything, right? From the way that the staff are trained, from the questions that are asked on intake forms, the posters on the walls, the bathrooms. Do you only have like a women's and a men's bathroom? Well, why? Well, if it's just a single stall bathroom, that should just be a gender inclusive and all gender washroom. Just let anyone go to whichever bathroom they want, right? And letting people decide for themselves, like, where do you feel safest sleeping?
Going past shelter. I remember years ago there was a movement of using housing first or supportive housing for youth. Yeah. Has that continued and grown?
Not enough. Absolutely not enough. But certainly there was much more conversation of trying to really incorporate housing first, much more, especially within the youth sector. It may look differently for different populations of young people. So for 2SLGBTQ youth, we do need population-based programming. So if it is a housing first program, then we need to make sure that it really is truly inclusive and that we do offer 2SLGBTQ population-based programming, meaning a program specifically made to target the needs of queer and trans youth, and it's a program meant specifically for queer and trans youth to access, right? Pretty much all of the work that I've done, all of the years, like every research study that I lead, one of the main findings every single time is around mental health. So many of the youth have mental health needs that are not being met. they are experiencing mental health difficulties, mental health issues, and their mental health needs are not being met. Even if they're in a great population-based housing program, oftentimes those housing programs, they just don't receive enough funding. They're just not designed to really, meet like complex mental health needs, or, oftentimes these are like highly independent programs. They're not emergency shelters. We don't actually have any like emergency shelters for queer and trans youth. And I understand that we're moving away from this like emergency shelter approach, which, I totally get that for sure. But at the same time, we do need to make sure that we are meeting the needs, the mental health needs of queer and trans youth, when we already know through so much research that this is not being met. And so we need much more specialized, like specific, intensive sort of mental health support available, because I don't think that we can end homelessness until we really, really, target this issue.
And if you're sleeping in a cemetery, I mean, what's going through your mind at night? All kinds of stuff is that I'm so low in society, I might as well be dead, right?
That's right.
I could see that as a very common thought for a youth that's finding a cemetery as home, if you would, or a safe place.
Because of these findings that I just spoke about in terms of like having, mental health needs that aren't being met. And it's like always like so many of the youth are experiencing high rates of anxiety and depression, suicidality, like just so much like mental health, right? Like mental health issues. Oftentimes people are like, oh, well, it has something to do with being 2SLGBTQ. Like if you're queer or trans, like, chances are you're going to have mental health issues. So they try to create that connection. It's like, oh, it's because you're queer. It's because you're trans. Clearly you're not, you're not okay. Like you just said, well, if you're sleeping in a cemetery at night, because that's your safest option, there's no doubt that's going to impact.
We all have our own challenges.
Yeah.
But when I look at you, I see okay. Right? And please take that as the compliment that it's meant to be.
Thank you.
Right? Trans people are painted as monsters.
Right.
You're definitely not a monster.
No, I'm definitely not.
Yeah. And I think, to me, that's how we start educating. Let people past their fears, past the Christian bullshit. So
yeah, I mean, a lot of it is so basic, right? Like even, in terms of like the whole thing about the pronoun, introducing yourself, your name, and people like love to complicate stuff. And it's not that complicated. Like the solutions, they're actually really not that complicated. So many of these solutions are so easy to implement, and we could be doing so much better than we are if we just got past it,
Right. I could talk to you forever, but how can people support your work?
Check out my website, and you can check out the different projects that we're working on. I'm not sure when this is going to be published, but we have a film screening. So we're always sharing the work on the website. Yeah, check it out.
Want to give the URL again?
Sure. It's alexabramovich.me.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.